Hello, welcome to Downtown. I'm your host, Robbie Haigh. It's been a little while, but I'm glad we're all back together here. Today I am interviewing Steven Tupper, who is Deputy Director of the Cape Cod Commission. And through Steven Tupper, we hope to learn a bit about the Cape Cod bridges and what's going on with them. Welcome to the show, Steven. It's so good to see you.
Happy to be here.
Thank you. So the Cape Cod Commission, it seems like there should be something after that.
Well, I'll add the something after that.
Thank you.
So the Cape Cod Commission is the regional land use, economic development, and regulatory agency for Cape Cod. So that's the 15 towns of Cape Cod from Bourne up to Provincetown.
Wow.
So we're involved in a whole host of areas. Basically anything of regional significance we're somehow involved in. So certainly I'll talk to transportation today, but we also have a lot of activity in terms of environmental protection, water resources, economic development,
excellent.
affordable housing. So certainly many areas that we touch.
And we love green. Okay, very good. Okay, so you can start where you wish. We want to know whatever you have time to tell us.
Okay. Well, I'll start high level, just talking about how the Cape Cod Commission and Cape Cod Commission staff are involved in the planning related to the canal. So as a regional planning agency, we're certainly interested in anything of regional significance. And I don't think there's any piece of infrastructure that's more important to Cape Cod than the Bourne and Sagamore bridges. So we're involved generally because it's certainly an important piece of infrastructure, but then more specifically, we're involved in a number of groups that have to do with funding the replacement of the bridges.
Okay. Now, is the Army Corps of Engineers still involved?
So absolutely. So right now the project is being led by a team of the Massachusetts Department of Transportation, MassDOT, along with the Army Corps of Engineers.
Oh, okay.
So the Army Corps owns and maintains all three of the bridges, actually Bourne, Sagamore, and the rail bridge, as well as the canal and the paths along it. And MassDOT owns all of the approaching infrastructure. So they're coordinating together on what is the best plan for those bridges in the long term.
Very good. And they are not going with the tunnel.
No, so maybe to step back to explain how they arrived at where they are today. The Army Corps, a couple of years back, did a major evaluation of what was the best decision for them in terms of maintaining the Bourne and Sagamore bridges. And they looked at a whole host of alternatives. It include looking at a tunnel. It include filling.
Did they really?
They did.
I thought it was a joke.
No, I think they're talking about a piece of infrastructure that's going to be here for generations.
Right.
So they wanted to look at everything. So they looked at a tunnel, in short, just cost prohibitive. They looked at options like filling in the Cape Cod Canal. That would be at odds with the navigation mission they have there. They looked at the potential for a new mid-span crossing, a bridge between the Bourne and Sagamore bridges. But ultimately, their decision was it was the best course of action to replace the two bridges roughly in the same location where they are today. So that's how we arrived at where we are today. And I should also note, in parallel, the Massachusetts Department of Transportation did a canal area study. They looked at all the infrastructure in the area and made decisions on what would be needed in terms of improving all of the approaching infrastructure. Think Bourne Rotary, other major approaches, if the bridges were replaced. So at this point, they're both coordinating on a joint initiative to really move forward those recommendations from the two studies.
It's a big deal.
It's a big deal. It's an expensive project, and we want to make sure it's done right and that the community is involved. So that's why we certainly want to get out there and talk to as many people as possible.
I'm sure it'll take time.
It'll take time and it'll take money.
Probably more time than we have heard in the past, but that's neither here nor there either. It's getting started, right?
Absolutely.
Now, the bridges were both built in around 1935?
Yes, correct. 1933 to 1935, the bridges were constructed. They were marvels of engineering at the time. They won national awards for the best new bridges coming out, and they really were quite impressive structures for their day. They
still are.
They are. They're certainly iconic of Cape Cod. They certainly are easily identifiable as an identity of the region. Unfortunately, they're, let's say at this point, 87 years old, and showing their age in many ways and not necessarily meeting the demands of today and the ones that we'll be seeing in the future. So certainly it's a challenge to think about a change of that significance, but one that really has to be taken seriously given the age of the structures.
Sure. Now, are both bridges going to be rebuilt at the same time or one at a time?
So the timing is something that will be decided a little later on in terms of the engineering design.
Okay.
So the initial studies pointed to the best course of action is replacing one and then replacing the next, one after the other. And the plan would be to do it like they've done some other major bridges, and that's build an entirely new structure parallel to the existing structure, and then once that's complete, essentially switch the traffic over. It's a little more complicated than that, but in essence, that's the idea, is that they can have a new bridge being built while the current bridges are still in operation to try to minimize overall impacts.
Yeah. Now, are the two bridges basically going to be going in the same direction?
In terms of the way they look and function?
Yes.
Yeah, so in general, they'll be built similar functionally to the way they are now, but up to modern standards.
Okay.
So you're going to see lane widths that are proper. Now they're certainly not meeting the size of current vehicles. There'll be improvements for shoulders for safety reasons, and there'll be safe accommodation for bicyclists and pedestrians, whereas right now it's a bit of a challenge to get over there as a pedestrian or a cyclist. And then maybe one other important thing to note is they will be including auxiliary lanes. So that's an additional lane to have to do with turning maneuvers. Wow. So just given the fact that we've got exits very close to the bridges on both sides, right now there's a lot of maneuvering on the bridges, and it really creates a safety and a congestion issue. So in terms of bringing it up to modern standards, they would be adding auxiliary lanes to each of the bridges as well.
Mm-hmm. Now, I was reading a little bit on it, of course, and in 1935, the population was like 36,000 plus, and I got quite a chuckle out of the fact that there were 1,500 cattle.
Yeah, I think that tells you the way things were back in the day. They were very carefully counting people and cattle. So,
but did the cattle use the bridge?
I don't think they used the bridge. I think it was a measure of how much activity was going on in the region, and I think that now we'd be using different metrics. I think we're in a little bit different place than we were back then.
And I've heard, people, of course, like to talk about how the bridges should work, and with maybe one should connect to 6A, and,
Yeah,
people do like to talk, and that's okay.
Everyone drives, so everyone's a traffic expert in some respect. So
right.
Certainly we heard a lot of comments throughout the process so far. I'll touch on it a bit later, but there are plenty of opportunities if people want to continue to get involved in the conversation. But there were questions about which roads should connect, what sort of other improvements are necessary. Certainly looking at something like the Bourne Rotary that currently is right at the base of the Bourne Bridge. That's the #1 crash location on Cape Cod. So that's something that would be addressed as they replace the infrastructure in that area.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah, a lot has happened since in the 87 years.
Yes, and it's continuing to get busier, and really we've seen a really heavy level of traffic the last decade plus. I'm sure everyone's familiar with the congestion there. And then one thing I just want to make clear is that the replacement of these bridges is because they're getting old and because we need reliable bridges. Right. The goal is not to have free-flowing traffic all of the time. There's going to be traffic in the summer. That's just the nature of the way our region is, and that's not, at least from what I've heard, not the overall goal of the project. It's really to have reliable crossings. Mm-hmm. We understand they're important for emergency vehicles. The canal splits the town of Bourne, so you've got people going to school on buses over the bridges, and really, I worry about really problems in terms of maintaining the structure given the ages of each of the bridges. So that's really the goal is reliability in my mind anyway, to make sure that we have that piece of infrastructure in the future.
How did you ever get involved with this, Steven?
So I grew up on Cape Cod, so born in Falmouth, and then went to school in the Nauset system. And I really enjoyed critical thinking, engineering early on. Went to University of Massachusetts Amherst for undergrad and graduate studies, focusing in on transportation engineering.
Yeah.
I was fortunate enough to get an internship with the Cape Cod Commission, literally counting cars in the summer, which
Very good.
is really the way to start. And then I've been fortunate to work my way up at the Cape Cod Commission. So really appreciate
Wonderful.
working in a community that I care about and being able to help the decision-making process for some really big decisions that are going to be made.
Fantastic. Yeah. Nothing like caring about the work that you're doing.
Absolutely. I think that's certainly shared across the agency. So no matter what the topic it is, we really appreciate going out to the community and making sure that we're making investments in the long term for the region.
Sure. Now, of course, how is this going to be paid for?
That's the multi-billion-dollar question there. So certainly the short answer is it's certainly going to take a number of different funding sources. So early on, the state, Mass DOT, committed to a large portion of it. They're funding the bulk of the current design work and the planning work that's going on. And they've also committed roughly $300 million to deal with the approaches and the other major infrastructures heading up to the bridges. So that's a state investment in this. And the missing piece, the piece that we hopefully will get some news in the coming months and years, is the federal piece of the puzzle. This is a federally owned bridges, the Army Corps of Engineers. So really, the need is for that big chunk of change to really fund the replacement of each of the bridges. So the Army Corps and Mass DOT have submitted a number of different federal grant applications. It's a good time since there's a good amount of money flowing in the bipartisan infrastructure law and other funding opportunities. But really, that's the next big piece of the puzzle. Once that big piece of federal investment gets clear, then things can start to have a much clearer path forward and a clearer timeline.
Good. And of course, since we're in the throes of election, roadways, bridges are number one on the list of conversation, I do believe.
Absolutely. Infrastructure in general and roads specifically are certainly something that connects to every person who has to get around. They see the potholes, they see the congestion and safety issues. So
and they know how to complain.
They know how to complain. So certainly we hope that works in favor of really getting the funding squared away to make sure that we can have a good path forward, because certainly the alternatives that are out there are not good for the region in terms of continued deterioration, congestion impacts. And maybe just to touch on one other thing, I think people have really seen the impacts of major construction activities when they have to do anything, even as simple as changing a light bulb. They're closing lanes on the bridges right now.
Right.
So the hope or the plan would be these new structures would be allowed to be maintained without that impact every time they need to do a maintenance activity.
And it was very interesting last summer, I do believe, when they were doing major painting on the bridges. And it's, I'm sure there are a lot of people who sit down by the canal and watch,
They watch
the
traffic.
sidewalk engineers. Yeah.
Absolutely, and it's maybe surprising to some to see when there's that sort of construction activity in the relatively quiet months of April, March. We see significant backups for people that are commuting on and off, that are making the trips they need to head to the rest of the part of the state. So no matter when they plan these these maintenance activities, which are certainly required, we see the impacts on the community.
And I'm sure there's a lot of looking on prior to anything being done.
Absolutely, and that's probably a good time to introduce some of the ongoing conversations around the canal bridges. Mass DOT and the Army Corps are jointly continuing to hold public meetings as there's new information to share and as they're looking for feedback from the communities. Cape Cod Commission keeps that information updated on our website, capecodcommission.org/canal. So if you're interested in what's going on, that's a one-stop shop in our house, and there's a project page on the Mass DOT side as well. Where we certainly post anytime there's a new public meeting. There will be a couple public meetings coming up in November.
Very good.
Specifically November 15th and 17th at 6 p.m. They're virtual public meetings. So those are up on both the commission website and on the project website, which is mass.gov/cape-bridges. So either of those places, you'll see the information on those upcoming meetings. And those are opportunities to learn what's going on and also to provide feedback along the way.
And we know things, dates change, time, everything changes as we get into this. When are they anticipating actually working on the bridges?
That's another great question and a challenging one to answer. So I'll preface it by I don't have any inside information on how the timing's going.
Okay.
And certainly it depends on some of the funding. That being said, we're still a couple years into design requirements, a couple more years for design and permitting before they'd be able to construct, even if they had a check to build the bridges tomorrow. So we're still a couple years away from that, and then this is a major infrastructure project that would take years to construct.
Right.
So certainly in the early studies, they were hoping to get going in the next 5 to 10 years. I don't have a crystal ball, so I can't tell exactly when they're going.
And even if you did.
Things change. But certainly the short answer is we're still a few years away, in my opinion. But there's certainly an understanding of the priority at the state and federal level for getting this done.
Yeah, it's certainly not something they could jump into.
No, and they need to be careful in terms of the way they plan these things, make sure the community's involved, make sure they're thinking about all of the impacts of the changes and of the construction. This is a once-in-a-generation investment, so you really want to make sure you do it right and think about all the modes of transportation, all the different options. So I know there's frustration that it takes time to do these things, but there are a lot of important decisions to be made.
But the bridges have lasted 87 years, and they still look extremely good.
It is true, and I do want to be clear that the Army Corps of Engineers does a great job of monitoring the condition of the bridges. They are inspected regularly. So while I fear for the long-term reliability, I certainly know that they're being well maintained today. The challenge is the maintenance would have to be much more frequent if they are not replaced, just the nature of a bridge that's that old. So they are going to continue to maintain them, but it gets more and more challenging as the infrastructure ages.
Sure. And maintenance costs also. So
absolutely, and that was part of the Army Corps when they looked at it, how much investment are they going to have to do to maintain the bridges as they are now, and what is the impact of those activities. They'd actually have to close the bridges twice in the next 50 years to do the maintenance that they need to do. Full closures, not lane closures that we're seeing, full closures. You can imagine the impact of that.
Do you think it is possible that one bridge is sufficient if the other has to be closed? I know it's a crazy question, but that's okay. I just do things like this.
Not at all, and it's an important one to think of. Certainly, if you're in an emergency situation, we've seen bridge closures across the nation when significant issues are found. And I would say that in terms of making sure that we have access to the rest of the state, yes, it can provide that access, but not without significant pain for the community. You'd be seeing significant impacts to anyone who's commuting. You'd be seeing impacts for the town of Bourne for emergency services. You've got people here heading off to hospitals off Cape. So the region could function, but not in a way that you would not see a lot of impacts for the entire community. So in a short term, yes. In the long term, that's certainly not a way to run a region of 200,000 people in the off season and many more during the summer.
Okay, we do know how much both bridges are used. I mean, you can stand back or sit back and be assured that they are totally used. Tell me a little bit about the train bridge.
So the train bridge is interesting, and if anyone hasn't taken a ride over it, it's certainly an interesting way to see the canal. It's important in terms of providing another transportation option, but overall the uses are fairly narrow at this point. So there is some hauling of trash over the bridges now, and there's some scenic trains.
From Cape to off Cape?
Yes. So it is more efficient to haul refuse, solid waste by train rather than by car. So that is happening to some degree, and certainly could increase in the future. There's opportunities for other freight over the bridges, although that really hasn't been utilized in the last several decades or more. In terms of passenger rail, there are some scenic trains that go over it, and then in the summer, the Cape Flyer runs service from Boston to Hyannis, which is a very popular service, and certainly a great way to visit the Cape without driving over the bridges. So certainly something we would like to see an increase of in the future, and even the potential in the long term for passenger rail service. Certainly want to make sure that there are options to come to the Cape.
Wonderful. Wonderful. And why just in the summer? Is it too dangerous in the cold and snow?
No. Certainly in terms of the Cape Flyer service, the demand seems to be highest in the summer. But over the last couple of years, we've worked on a number of projects where we've heard interest in extending it. And it's certainly possible. From an operational standpoint, the Cape Flyer covers its costs, which is something you don't see often in rail service. So certainly something I would love to see further investigation of in terms of increasing rail service to the region.
Yeah, the train bridge is certainly a beautiful edifice.
Absolutely, yeah, and that was redone more recently in terms of a rehabilitation. So relatively
Really?
speaking, it's in decent shape given its age.
Very good.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Looks like a very interesting project, very long project.
Mm-hmm.
Is there, I know this is another one of those way out there questions, is there a possibility that the people of Massachusetts can get involved in this fundraising? Not that they'd want to as we speak now. There's too much going on, but
Yeah, so certainly fundraising, I think more specifically advocacy is probably the way I would characterize it. Making sure that at the meetings that are being held by Mass DOT and the Army Corps that the residents share how important these bridges are. And then ultimately the funding, much of it will come through the political process. So if there's an opportunity to talk to local legislators, those up in down in DC as well, I think it's important that they recognize the importance of these bridges. I know I've talked with them personally, and I know they do understand the importance, but I think the more constituents that reach out, it's always important to keep these things on the radar, given all of the different priorities that exist.
sure. When the canal was initially being built, there were a lot of different people who were working on the construction.
Mm-hmm.
So it should continue, right?
Absolutely, it would certainly be an enormous construction project from a scale of Cape Cod, and great to see hopefully a lot of local employment coming out of those construction activities. I know it was enormously important at the time, back in the 30s. That was an important part of the really push to do these major infrastructure projects, and certainly still a need for quality jobs, and that could be part of the conversation for sure.
Very good. Okay, the Mass DOT and the Army Corps of Engineers working closely together to get this accomplished. Yeah. Is there anything else that you would bring to the table right now?
I think maybe one thing to highlight at this point in the process is that the study team's really looking at how to evaluate different options. So there's a recognition that the bridges need to be replaced, but the specifics in terms of the way that bridges look, how all the infrastructure connecting to it are still under development. So it's an important time to weigh in terms of what's important to the community. So if they want to evaluate it for safety, that's one aspect of it. Congestion reduction, you can think about environmental benefits in terms of reducing congestion, the aesthetic value of the new structures. So if there's something that's important to someone here, certainly this is the time in the process to weigh in to make sure that the study team is considering those things as they look at different options.
So it certainly would behoove the people in the community to get to these meetings and hear firsthand what the plan is.
Absolutely, and if they're not able to attend the meetings, there's also opportunities to provide comments at any point in time. So certainly there's many ways to engage in the process.
Yes, we are certainly not at a loss for communication.
Mm-hmm. For sure.
Very good. Well, this is wonderful. It's so good to have you here. And there's no reason why we can't continue to get information from you as the project is going along.
Absolutely, always happy to come back and share updates on the project.
That's absolutely fantastic. Yeah, I truly appreciate you, Steven.
Thanks for inviting. Nice having a conversation today.
My pleasure. And as you know, I've been speaking with Steven Tupper about the Cape Cod bridges, and to be continued. Thank you all for being here and watching, listening to Downtown, and we hope to see you again real soon.